welcome to the fourth Metaphysics Lecture of term. This week we'll be discussing the topic of possibility and identity, and this follows on very much from last week's lecture on possible worlds. So, as usual, I'm going to follow the slides as we go through the lecture. So I'll just make those full screen. I said possibility and identity, necessity and identity. Necessity and possibility just flip sides of one another. So if P is necessary, then it's not possible that not P. The topic can be described in either way. Okay, so as we saw last week, we can explain possibility and necessity in terms of possible worlds. So we focused actually on possibilities. So we normally say that something is possible if and only if it holds at least one possible world, whereas it's necessary if and only if it holds at every possible world. And obviously last week we looked at some theories about what possible worlds are. Now, so necessary truth, as I say, would be something that's true in all possible worlds. So, for example, mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4, conceptual truths like all bachelors are unmarried, so that's true by definition, so true in all possible worlds. On the other hand, we might have necessary falsehoods that are false in all possible worlds, so 2 + 2 = 5, or some bachelors are married. Those would be examples of necessary falsehoods. From these, philosophers distinguish contingent truths and contingent falsehoods. So something's contingently true if it's true in the actual world, commonly denoted using the @ symbol, but is false in some other world. So Biden is the 46th president of the United States is true in our world, but may well be false in other possible worlds. So maybe there's a world in which Bernie Sanders is the 46th president of the United States, for instance. Australia was first discovered by Europeans in 1606. Now, that's true as far as we know in our world, but again, maybe false in other worlds. So it might be that, in some worlds, the discovery of Australia by Europeans was delayed, or maybe in other worlds it came earlier, and so on. Contingent falsehoods, just the flip side of contingent truths. So false in the actual world, but true in some possible worlds. So Trump is the 46th president of the United States of America, is false in the actual world. Actually, in the actual world, he was the 45th president of the United States. But it seems that there's a possible world, or possible worlds, in which he's the 46th president. So had he not won office last time, but won office this time. Likewise, it's false, but presumably possibly true, that Australia was first discovered by Europeans in 1607. Just imagine the voyage got blown off course and was delayed until the Europeans' arrival was delayed until 1607. That seems perfectly possible. Now, so I've distinguished so far between necessary truths and contingent truths. Now, interestingly, it's quite common among philosophers to distinguish different sorts of necessity and correspondingly different sorts of possibility. As I say, necessity and possibility are kind of flip sides of one another. So a common distinction is between, on the one hand, physical possibility and physical necessity, and on the other hand, what's known as metaphysical possibility or metaphysical necessity. Now, you might often also hear talk of logical possibility and logical necessity. So some philosophers equate that with metaphysical necessity, but we're going to see later in this lecture that there might be some grounds for at least hesitating to do so. But we'll come back to that. So metaphysical necessity is normally taken to be necessity in the strongest sense. So a proposition, that is a sentence meaning, is metaphysically necessary or metaphysically necessarily true if and only if it's true in absolutely every possible world whatsoever. So presumably 2 + 2 = 4 falls into that category. Bachelors are unmarried falls into that category. Mathematical truths, logical truths would seem to fall into the category of being metaphysically necessary. On the other hand, at least some philosophers want to distinguish a notion of physical or nomological necessity. So a proposition is said to be physically necessary if it's true in not all worlds whatsoever, but all physically possible worlds. Well, what's a physically possible world? A physically possible world is a world that has the same laws of nature as our actual world. So in other words, the laws of nature that actually obtain make the truth in question necessary. So the idea, basically these two notions of necessity are different from one another, provided you think that the laws of nature could actually have been otherwise. So as long as you think that the laws of nature are metaphysically contingent, that is to say, if we examine the space of all possible worlds whatsoever, we'll find at least some that have laws of nature that are different from our own, then there's a genuine distinction between physical and metaphysical necessity. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Just examples. So I gave some examples of metaphysical necessity. So 2 + 2 = 4. All bachelors are unmarried. Either Trump is president or Trump isn't president. These seem like good examples of metaphysical necessities. On the other hand, physical necessities would be propositions that must be true in virtue of the laws of nature, the laws of physics, if you like. So maybe nothing travels faster than the speed of light, or at least no massive object travels faster than the speed of light. Total mass energy in the universe is conserved. These are consequences of what we currently take, at least, to be the laws of nature. So if those are the true laws of nature, then these look like physical necessities. So as I said, most philosophers think that metaphysical necessity and physical necessity are genuinely distinct. They're different things. And the reason is they think that there are worlds in which the laws of nature might have been different. So, we actually, I guess, think that quantum mechanics and general relativity are true in our world. There's obviously a bit of uncertainty because, it might be that they are actually succeeded by a later theory once we maybe have more scientific evidence or we do more theorizing about the world. So you can't rule out that possibility. But one thing we do now think is that, for instance, Newtonian mechanics is almost certainly wrong about our world, even though it's approximately right in many ways. But we think that, strictly speaking, Newtonian mechanics is false of the actual world. But many philosophers would want to allow that there are possible worlds in which Newtonian mechanics is true. And this would show that there are metaphysical possibilities that are not permitted by the laws of nature. So certain phenomena that are compatible with the Newtonian laws are incompatible with the laws of special and general relativity. For instance, it's perfectly compatible with the Newtonian laws that a massive object should travel faster than the speed of light. There's nothing in Newtonian mechanics to rule that out. So that would seem like a metaphysical possibility that isn't physically possible. Now, why should we think that there are worlds where the actual laws of physics don't hold? Well, I mean, sort of generally, the kind of reason for thinking that there are possible worlds is to make sense of our modal and counterfactual reasoning, our reasoning about, as Lewis puts it, ways things might have been different from the way they actually are. Now, scientists often reason about what things would have been like if the laws of nature had been different. If you're a physicist, then one way of testing, for instance, which are the true laws of nature, for instance, whether general relativity is true or whether Newtonian mechanics is true, is by thinking about what empirical results would be observable on each hypothesis. So you can reason, well, if general relativity were true, we'd expect X. If Newtonian mechanics were true, we'd expect Y. So we're reasoning about what would be the case if Newtonian mechanics is true, but that, on the assumption that Newtonian mechanics is false, is an example of reasoning about a metaphysical possibility that's not a physical possibility. So famously, one of the confirmations of general relativity was Eddington's observation of the bending of light from distant stars around the sun. So basically, this was taken to confirm general relativity, which says that massive objects distort space-time and so curve light, whereas Newtonian mechanics implies nothing of the sort. So he could reason that if Newtonian mechanics were true, he wouldn't observe the bending, but if general relativity is true, then he would observe the bending. What was actually observed was that the light was indeed bent in the way predicted by general relativity, but this involved his sort of confirmation, involved this counterfactual reasoning about what would have been the case had Newtonian mechanics been true. And so maybe when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about metaphysically possible worlds that aren't physically possible. Okay, so just a kind of Venn diagram representation. The idea is that the physically possible worlds are a subset of the metaphysically possible worlds. So everything that's physically possible is metaphysically possible, but not vice versa. So it's not physically possible that Newtonian mechanics is true, but it's metaphysically possible that it's true. Okay, so that's some sort of background to our topic, and a bit of background on the notion of necessity and possibility. Now, one very influential thinker on the nature of necessity, and also the connection between necessity and identity, which is another key topic that we've looked at this term, is Sol Kripke. And his thinking, as well as Lewis's, on the topic have been massively influential in contemporary metaphysics, so certainly worth looking at. Now, Kripke points out that it's quite common for philosophers to make distinctions among categories of truth or true proposition. So, as we've just seen, philosophers distinguish between necessary truths and contingent truths. Here, for now, we'll focus on metaphysical necessities. So, basically, unless I say otherwise, when I say necessary from now on and contingent, I'll mean metaphysically necessary, metaphysically contingent, rather than physically necessary or physically contingent. So then a necessary truth, as we've seen, is one that couldn't have been false. It's true in absolutely all possible worlds, whereas contingent truth might have been false, so it's true in the actual world, but not in all possible worlds. So this is a metaphysical distinction. I mean, the clue's in the name in a way. So it's a distinction between how things are, or it has to do with how things are or how they might have been. So it doesn't really concern, human perspectives or human knowledge or anything like that. It seems to be just a metaphysical distinction about the nature of things. On the other hand, Kripke points out that it's been common, certainly Kant explicitly makes this distinction between a priori truths and a posteriori truths, but the sort of distinction, maybe not expressed with that terminology, is an old one, a much older one than Kant. So the idea of an a priori truth is one that one could know independently of experience. So you don't need to look at the world. You don't need to do any experiments or perform any observations of the world to know that it's true. So 2 + 2 = 4, and more generally mathematical truths and logical truths look like good candidates for a priori truth, right? So you don't need to look at the world to tell that 2 and 2 = 4. It's supposed to sort of follow from the concepts or the principles of mathematics. You don't perform an experiment or do an observation to tell that it's true. Or at least you don't have to, right? So maybe there are sort of ways of checking it empirically, like using a calculator. But the idea is that in principle, you could know it a priori, that is, without looking at the world. On the other hand, a posteriori truths are ones that can only be known by looking at the world, by experience, observation, or experiment. So, for instance, grass is green, right? That's not an a priori truth. It's not a logical truth. It's one that we'd only be able to tell by looking at the world. Now, by contrast to the necessary contingent distinction, this distinction looks like an epistemological one, right? So it has to do with what we know and how we know it. So that's sort of core epistemology. Now, Kripke points out that philosophers have often supposed that necessary truths are knowable, at least potentially, on a priori grounds. We can, if a truth is necessary, then it's something that we should, at least in principle, be able to figure out without experience. On the other hand, contingent truths are ones that can't, this is according to sort of traditional philosophy, contingent truths can't be known on a priori grounds. So we have to actually look at the world in order to figure out whether a contingent truth, a contingent proposition, is genuinely true. So we can only know those a posteriori. So I mean, like, there's a sort of kind of reasons for this. So you might think that the sort of basic reason would be to think that, well, a contingent truth is something that holds of our world, but it doesn't hold of other possible worlds. So you might think, well, it's obvious we're going to have to look at the world to tell whether it's true or not, because we're going to have to sort of figure out what kind of world we're in, whether we're in the sort of world where it holds or the sort of world where it doesn't. Whereas a necessary truth holds across all possible worlds. So you might reason that whether it holds or not doesn't depend upon particular features of our world. So in a sense, there's no point looking at those particular features. If it's true across possible worlds, we should be able to figure that out without looking. But so that's the sort of traditional way of reasoning that Kripke attributes to philosophers. However, he wants to argue that that sort of traditional way of reasoning is faulty. And in fact, there are examples of necessary truths that are actually knowable only a posteriori, and can't be known on a priori grounds. And on the other hand, there are examples of contingent truths that can be known a priori, that is, without looking at the world. So this the idea of a simple correspondence between the necessary and the a priori, and between the contingent and the a posteriori, thoroughly breaks down according to Kripke. So in order to see what Kripke's argument is, we've got to consider a bit of background in terms of his philosophy of language. So Kripke uses the term designator, the word designator, to cover both proper names. So Donald Trump is a proper name, and it's a designator. It designates a particular object, namely the man Donald Trump. And also, another sort of designator is a definite description. So a definite description is a description that singles out one object uniquely. So, for instance, the 45th President of the United States is a definite description. It singles out, not by name, like Donald Trump, but it still singles out one object uniquely. And the object, again, in this case, is Donald Trump. So the idea is that both names and definite descriptions refer to particular objects or events, right? So an event can have a name like World War One, or it can be singled out by a definite description, like the war that was arguably caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's a definite description that picks out World War One. Okay, so a bit more terminology. So we've seen what a designator is. A designator is some expression in language that picks out a unique object. Kripke introduces this further bit of jargon, the notion of a rigid designator. So a rigid designator is a designator that refers to the same object in all possible worlds in which that object exists. So this is probably best seen by example. So Kripke argues that proper names are rigid designators. For instance, Donald Trump. So it's not just a designator. It, in other words, picks out a particular entity, namely Donald Trump the man. But that name picks out Donald Trump not just in our world, but in every world in which Donald Trump exists. Now, one thing to note here is that Kripke seems to be presupposing that objects have cross-world identity, and that conflicts with Lewis's view. Lewis thinks that there isn't identity of objects like Trump across possible worlds, but rather they merely have counterparts in other possible worlds. Now, probably you could adapt the notion of a rigid designator to a sort of counterpart theory. So the idea would roughly be that Donald Trump designates Donald Trump in the actual world and designates his counterpart in every world in which he has one. So you don't need to necessarily read too much into this presupposition of identity across worlds. Now, so when thinking about the notion of a rigid designator, a designator that picks out the same object in all possible worlds, with proper names being, according to Kripke, the prime example of this, it's worth noting that this is perfectly compatible with the point that objects are named differently in different possible worlds. So it's true that there are possible worlds in which Donald Trump has a different name, right? So Donald Trump might be called Bob Smith in some other worlds, just because of maybe an eccentric naming decision by his parents. Even though it's the same person, it's just the same person with another name. But the point about rigid designation is that whenever someone uses the name Donald Trump in the actual world to talk about an individual in another possible world, it designates Donald Trump in that world, right? So if you take the top sentence on the slide, I said there are possible worlds in which Donald Trump has a different name, and presumably what I said made sense to you. But then what I'm doing here is using the name Donald Trump. So I'm here in the actual world using the name Donald Trump to refer to this guy, who's the same guy as exists in the actual world, even though in the world in question, the world I'm talking about, I'm supposing he has a different name, but I'm still able to use the name that he has in the actual world to pick out him as he exists in this other possible world, even though he has a different name in that other possible world. And that's an example of the name Donald Trump functioning as a rigid designator. Now, by contrast, non-rigid designators don't refer to the same object in all possible worlds. So definite descriptions, although they're designators, are typically non-rigid. So, for instance, the definite description, the 45th President of the United States, refers to Donald Trump in the actual world, but presumably it refers to Hillary Clinton, or maybe even other people too, in other possible worlds, because presumably there are possible worlds in which a few things went differently, the vote was slightly different, and in fact Hillary Clinton was the 45th President of the United States. So the non-rigidness of the expression, the definite description, the 45th President of the United States, is brought out by this counterfactual that I have on the slide. If Hillary Clinton had won the 2016 election, then the 45th President of the United States would have been a Democrat, right? Clearly that doesn't mean that if Hillary Clinton had won the 2016 election, then Donald Trump would have been a Democrat. And so that illustrates the non-rigidity of the expression, the 45th President of the United States. So if it were a rigid designator and picked out Donald Trump, who's in fact the 45th President of the United States, in all worlds in which it exists, then this first counterfactual would have the meaning given by the second counterfactual, but that's just not the case. So actually what the first counterfactual is supposing is that if Clinton had won, then the 45th president would have been Clinton, who's a Democrat. So the 45th president is non-rigid. It refers to Trump in this world, but it refers to Clinton in some other possible worlds. Okay, so that's a lot of sort of background philosophy of language that's going to be important going forward. So I said that Kripke believes that there are some necessary truths that are discovered only a posteriori. That is, only by empirical investigation of the world. And a key example that actually was one used by Frege, but is adapted for his own purposes by Kripke, is the example of Hesperus and Phosphorus. So the story here is that the ancient Greeks observed a particularly bright celestial body at a particular position in the evening sky, and another particularly bright celestial body at a particular position in the morning sky, and one they designated Hesperus, and the other they designated Phosphorus, although actually those sound like Latinized versions. I don't really know. I'm not very good at Greek and Latin. But the Greeks. It was the Greeks definitely. I think the story is that the Greeks named the celestial bodies differently, and yeah, okay, and so they presume them to be different objects, right? And apparently they were thinking of them as being stars or something like stars. Now it turned out that so Hesperus was used by the Greeks to refer to an apparent star that appeared at a certain point in the sky in the evening. Phosphorus was used to refer to an apparent star that appeared at a certain point in the morning. Now it turned out, so when techniques for astronomy became more sophisticated, it turned out that actually both names picked out the same object, and that object wasn't a star at all, it was the planet Venus. So astronomers discovered through observation that Hesperus is identical to Phosphorus. Hesperus and Phosphorus are the planet Venus. So Kripke's point is that the names Hesperus and Phosphorus, being proper names, rigidly designate. So each refers to the planet Venus, and indeed refers to the planet Venus in every world in which Venus exists. And so he observes that it appears that Hesperus is Phosphorus is a necessary truth. There's no world in which Hesperus isn't Phosphorus, because that would be equivalent to saying that there's a world in which Venus is not Venus. So it looks like that's a necessary truth. However, the identity was discovered a posteriori, right? So the Greeks, there was no sort of, not only did the Greeks not know that Hesperus was Phosphorus, it doesn't seem there's anything they could have done kind of a priori to figure that out. So it wasn't like they committed some error of reasoning that led them to assume that Hesperus was not Phosphorus. Rather, what we actually needed to do was to invent better telescopes and maybe better mathematics and keep better track of celestial bodies in order to know that actually Hesperus and Phosphorus were the same thing. So Kripke thinks that this is a good example of a necessary truth that was discovered only a posteriori, and indeed could have only been discovered a posteriori, could not have been discovered a priori. So this is an example where the idea that there's a simple mapping between the necessary and the a priori breaks down. Okay, so what to make of Kripke's argument? Well, I mean, I suppose there are possible objections to it. So this sort of so one way of responding would be to say, well, Hesperus is Phosphorus is really expressing the same proposition as Venus is Venus. That's what makes you think it's necessarily true. There's no world in which Venus isn't Venus. And that's what essentially you're taking to be the meaning of Hesperus is Phosphorus. And that's why you infer that Hesperus is Phosphorus is a necessary truth. But you might think, well, actually we didn't discover a posteriori that this proposition, Venus is Venus, is true, right? That is a priori. That, anyone, even if you don't know what Venus refers to or what Venus is Venus is an obvious a priori truth. So you might say that we didn't really discover that the proposition's true, but rather what we discovered is that a particular sentence, namely Hesperus is Phosphorus, happens to express that proposition, expresses the proposition Venus is Venus. So that would be a kind of line of counter-argument to Kripke, that actually the necessary truth, namely the proposition Venus is Venus, is something knowable a priori, and the claim would be that he's confusing the way we know that proposition, namely a priori, with the a posteriori means by which we learn that a particular sentence, Hesperus is phosphorus, happens to express that proposition. Now, I guess this is a bit controversial. It takes you into some, I guess, difficult controversial issues to do with what a proposition is, how a sentence relates to a proposition, and so on. But it looks like an arguable point. So maybe an analogy that makes it a bit clearer. So de Fenton is French. It expresses the same proposition as 2 + 2 = 4 does in English. So you might say, look, the proposition expressed by these two sentences, the mathematical truth that 2 + 2 = 4, is not something that you need to discover a posteriori, in other words, by looking at the world, right? So this is a sort of paradigmatic example of an a priori knowable truth. But you do discover, or at least I discovered, a posteriori that the French sentence expressed this proposition, right? So, I had to learn a bit of French, and this required some experience of the world to know how the French experience of how the French use language to learn that it expressed this proposition. So the idea is that Hesperus is phosphorus is like de Fenton, in that what we discover a posteriori is that that sentence expresses a necessary proposition, but what we didn't discover a posteriori was that the necessary proposition was true. So certainly there is a sort of possible pushback against Kripke. What does Kripke say about so on the other hand, if you recall, he claimed that there are contingent truths that are knowable a priori. Now, Kripke's example is quite complex. I'll give a simpler example that I think works just as well later on, but at least bear with me while I try and explain Kripke's example. So, Kripke distinguishes between giving the meaning of a word and fixing its reference. So I guess there's giving the meaning of the word might be something like providing a kind of dictionary definition, so that a language user could understand one word in terms of other words and their meanings. Fixing the reference of an object, fixing the reference of a word is basically establishing what that word's going to refer to. So, at least on Kripke's view, there are some words that really just have reference rather than an additional meaning. So, proper names are arguably a case in point, right? So, Luke Fenton-Glynn or Donald Trump, those names don't really have a meaning. All they are sort of like labels for objects. So all we really do is fix the reference in those cases, where in other cases, I don't know, a word like justice, we might feel like we can give a meaning rather than merely fix a reference. Now, Kripke's going to examine a case where we have a word, in this case, 1 meter, or I guess a phrase, such that we can both give a meaning and fix its reference. And so he's got this example of the international prototype meter. So this isn't actually how a meter is defined now. It's defined in terms of fundamental physical quantities. but we'll stick with the original way in which a meter was defined. And you can say similar things given the more contemporary definition of a meter. But anyhow, so basically what happened was that there was a conference in Paris that ordered the production of a bar of platinum iridium that was going to serve as the international prototype meter. So, in case of doubt, in case of doubt about whether your meter stick was the right length, you'd compare it to this bar, at least in principle. Okay. So there's a sense in which this conference defined the expression 1 meter as the length of this platinum iridium bar at a particular time. So I've just speculated 12 noon on the 24th of September 1889, let's say. Now, they did define a meter in a sense, but Kripke says that the sort of definition that they provided doesn't give the meaning of a meter, but rather just fixes its reference. So a meter, in a way, what they're doing is showing how 1 meter can be used as a label for the length of the platinum iridium bar. So he thinks the meaning of the expression 1 meter is a certain length. So that length is roughly 39.37 inches, apparently. And so, if you were to give the meaning of 1 meter, you would have to do something like that. Say, well, 1 meter, is a metric measurement that corresponds to a length of 39.37 inches or something like that. Whereas if you were merely interested in giving the reference, fixing the reference, then you can say 1 meter is the length of this bar. So the idea here is, well, the conference sort of already had a kind of meaning in mind, and they wanted, the sort of they wanted a measure of a length that was, just under 40 inches for whatever reason. And they ordered the manufacture of this bar to a particular length in order to mark out this length. So Kripke asks of this sentence, is it a necessary truth? So the international prototype meter is 1 meter long at the particular time when it was produced, say. Is that a necessary truth? And he argues that no, it's not a necessary truth, it's a contingent truth. So had heat been applied to the bar shortly before the particular time, 12 noon, 24th of September 1889, then it would have expanded. And so it would have had a length different from a meter. That is, it would have had a length that was different from 39.37 inches. So it's not necessary truth, it's just contingent truth about this bar that it's a meter long. Nevertheless, he says, for the people who fixed the reference of 1 meter as the length of the bar at 12 noon on the 24th of September 1889, they can know a priori that the international prototype meter, the bar, was 1 meter long at that time. And the idea is that they know this a priori because they just stipulated that the term 1 meter is to stand for that length. It was sort of up to them what 1 meter was going to refer to, and they chose that it was going to refer to the length of this bar. So just by having the power of stipulation and knowing this stipulation, they can know that the international prototype meter is a meter, it has this particular length, without doing any empirical investigation. So the idea is that they have an a priori knowledge of what's a contingent truth, namely that the stick is a meter long. Now, this example is pretty complicated, and I kind of have the impression that it's needlessly complicated, actually. So I think the following example will do just as well, and I think it's a bit more intuitive. So suppose I buy a dog and I decided to call it George. So for me, the sentence, my dog's name is George, is a priori. I don't have to check anything in the world to know that he's called George, right? It's my decision what he's called. I'm the one that gets to stipulate, just as the committee got to stipulate what the expression 1 meter would refer to. I get to stipulate what this dog's name is. It's just a sort of social legal convention about dog ownership. So for me, it's a priori that this dog's name is George. Nevertheless, it seems plausible it's contingent that my dog's name is George, because of course I could have called him by a different name instead, right? I could have easily called him Rupert or something similar. And so it looks like for me, my dog's name is George is a priori, but my dog's name is George is nevertheless a contingent truth. So this seems to work just analogously to Kripke's example. So the idea is that for the committee, the stick's length is a meter is a priori because they're the ones that get to stipulate what the expression 1 meter stands for, but it's contingent because the bar could have been a different length, and if you like, they could have used the a meter to refer to a different length. Okay. And there are other examples. So I think I find the dog example more intuitive, certainly more straightforward. But basically the same idea is being captured. Alvin Plantinga interestingly suggests another example. Which is actually quite rather different from the examples that we've considered so far. It doesn't particularly have to do with, or it doesn't really at all have to do with designation in the way the previous two examples did. And this is Descartes' reasoning, I think, therefore I am. And he says, well, look, Descartes is, or Descartes exists, is, or at least was at the time Descartes was thinking it, a contingent truth, right? Descartes doesn't necessarily exist. He's not godlike, doesn't exist in all possible worlds. So Descartes exists as a contingent truth. But if Descartes' right, then, and this was Descartes' argument, but many of you will be familiar with it, then his existence was just a priori for him, right? So the very fact that he's thinking, he thinks, implies his existence. So he doesn't need to look at the world in order to know whether it exists. He can discern it from the very fact that he's thinking. So that, as I say, Plantinga's example, rather different because it doesn't rely upon language at all seemingly. Certainly doesn't rely on the issue of designation, which both my dog example and Kripke's example do. But again, arguably is another case in which we have a breakdown between the standard or traditional distinctions, sorry, I should say the standard or traditional notion that the a priori, a posteriori distinction maps neatly onto the necessary contingent distinction. Okay, so that's it for this week. And next week we're going to start to look at causation. So we're spending 2 weeks on causation. And it's particularly the second week, actually, that connects back to the themes of this week and last week, because there we're going to look at counterfactual theories of causation. And, of course, one of the reasons we've been looking at the notions of possibility and necessity is because counterfactual reasoning is important in language, reasoning about what might have been. And one very influential theory of causation takes this sort of counterfactual reasoning to be intimately bound up with facts about causation. And, causation, of course, is very central to understanding and controlling the world around us. So, for instance, we might look at the causes of the COVID-19 pandemic in order to figure out, firstly, how to understand it, but also how to prevent similar pandemics from occurring in the future. Also, maybe to predict its evolution over time. And so this sort of causal reasoning's very important to us. And so to the extent that causation is tightly bound up with counterfactuals, then that's going to be important to us too. Anyway, that's a story for later in term. Thanks for listening, and I will speak to you all again next week. Bye.